And then, as we were looking at our embodied dramaturgy and then at the sociocultural inscriptions that bodies carry, we became more and more interested in this idea of how does blackness come into relation and into friction with dance dramaturgy. I think that was interesting for us.
Hello, and welcome to the Fourth Space podcast. In this episode, we are thrilled to host a podcast discussion with Matthew-Robin Nye, Dana Dugan, Cadu Mello, and Vanessa Montesi, who are all members of the Dramaturgical Ecologies project. Dramaturgical Ecologies is a research creation project led by Angélique Willkie that is working at the intersection of dance dramaturgy and Black performance studies. And this semester, they are putting on a series of events aimed at provoking conversations that move between disciplines, concepts, scholars, and practitioners, and that aim to generate and destabilize dialogue and reflection on Black performance. Thanks for listening. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kiyunkahaga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. And Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it is a home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. And we respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community.
Great. Thank you very much, Anna and Doug and Fourth Space for having us here. My name is Matthew Nye. I am a PhD candidate here at Concordia University in the Interdisciplinary Humanities program. And I am joined by three of the six artist, researcher, scholars who are the research assistants for Angélique Willkie's a Dramaturgical Ecologies project. I will allow them each to introduce themselves. Cadu, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Cadu Mello. I'm a PhD student at the Humanities Interdisciplinary Program, and also a collaborator in the Dramaturgical Ecologies group.
And I am Vanessa Montesi. I am a PhD candidate in comparative studies at the University of Lisbon, where I have just submitted my PhD thesis on theatrical dance as a form of intermediate translation. And I'm a research assistant at Dramaturgical Ecologies and also founding member of the research group Parte in Lisbon.
My name is Dana Dugan. I'm a performance-based artist scholar, PhD student at the HUMA program at Concordia. Also a member of the Dramaturgical Ecologies group, and I'm also American, a mother, things like that.
Today we're coming together to have an informal conversation about the Dramaturgical Ecologies research group. Dramaturgical Ecologies is a 2.5-year-old research project that is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the FRQSC. We have recently been successful in Connections SSHRC application to extend our research in a sort of ancillary project called Murmurations to the end of this year. That application was also supported by the Milieu Institute, the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture, and Fourth Space has been a generous presenter of our work in our meetings coming together. In the Murmurations project, which we're leading into with the ABCs of Dramaturgical Ecologies, we are also being joined by a partner nonprofit organization, the Three Ecologies Institute. Does one of you want to start off by introducing Angélique Willkie and maybe the start of the Dramaturgical Ecologies project?
I can take a stab at it. So Angélique began this project because she was interested in looking at the embodied dramaturgy of the performer that's often not acknowledged, the specificity of an embodied dramaturgy of a performer within contemporary dance, because it's often not considered. And in her decisions about how she was going to go about this research. She chose herself just kind of out of convenience. So she became the object of study for the project. And in the process, we had COVID, we had Black Lives Matter. As we began closer looking at this idea of the embodied dramaturgy of the performer, it became clear that Blackness was what some of her Blackness was something that became a central interest in our research, accompanied with the notion of dramaturgy, which ends up being the two pillars, foundational and conceptual pillars of the work that we're doing now. And then also in that process, the research creation aspect of it, or the primary part of it, was a work she did with Melanie Demers and her company Mayday, and the work was called Confession Publique, which premiered last year at La Chapelle. And so much of the work that we've done discursively has come out of the non-discursive work that was going on with Confession Publique.
So maybe I can ask you a follow-up question there, Dana. When you say much of the work that we're doing comes out of Confession Publique, can you sort of describe that a little bit for someone who's not familiar with our project, how research creation is working as a sort of a research council funded event here? What brings us together in relation to Confession Publique?
Well, in the research creation portion of this, there's the creative part, which is Confession Publique, which she did with Melanie Demers. And the research aspect of it was formed she had an interviewing process and ended up creating the group that we have here, plus others. And as she was going through the process in the creative research part of the development of Confession Publique, we would enter the process at different moments in the creative process. And in that, there would be questions about the process and, in terms of how choices were made, how the dramaturgy that was going on for herself as the performer was influencing dramaturgies that were existing on the creation as a whole. And so over the course of that time, this has been how we've deepened our investigations on Blackness and dramaturgy.
Yeah, maybe it's interesting to say that in Confession Publique, Angélique was both the dramaturge and the performer. So initially we were really looking at how her embodied dramaturgy as a performer would shift the creative process, and that we did that through a series of interesting interviews that we carried out because we couldn't meet in person, which ended up in an article that we published in Repertório, a journal, Brazilian journal for performance studies. And then as we were looking at our embodied dramaturgy and then at the sociocultural inscriptions that bodies carry, we became more and more interested in this idea of how does Blackness come into relation and into friction with dance dramaturgy. I think that was interesting for us to delve in a little bit more deeply.
Yeah, if I may give a bit of an introduction, sort of biographically, to Angélique, who is the principal investigator of this of Dramaturgical Ecologies, and for whom the central research creation activity Confession Publique was oriented around. Angélique was born in Jamaica, moved to Canada, I believe, as a teenager, and then spent 25 years really developing a practice in the context of European concert dance and dramaturgy. She's now a full professor here at Concordia University, and the Dramaturgical Ecologies project has also, in this very personal way, charted some personal explorations that she's been sharing with us, and that we've been a part of through these discussions. And so Dramaturgical Ecologies as a research group came together just before COVID, just before lockdown. So most of the conversations that we've all had together have been in this format on Zoom. So there's been a sort of a frontality and a flattening out, and yet a real sort of community building that's taken place with us through the Dramaturgical Ecologies project. Now, Angélique started off this project against the neutral canvas, and she was thinking about the role of the embodied dramaturgy of a performer in the dance creation process, in the performance and dance specifically creation process. And so one of the things that we talked about was the concept of neutrality. And this idea of neutrality is the idea that there is an unencumbered body that enters as the dancer into a performance creation context. And so specifically, we're looking at the dancer. Now, the premise that I understand this research project to have started with was Angélique's question, well, what about the inheritances of the individual that is walking into a room? But what became really central to this project was, and as I said, this is the sort of autoethnographic portion of this research creation process, was the fact that, as we know, at the same time that the world locked down because of COVID-19, there were multiple murders of unarmed Black people, particularly in the United States, but also here in Canada and elsewhere in the world. And so the question of the embodiment of Blackness, what in other contexts we might call a para-ontology of Blackness, which understands that Blackness is not just embodiment, it's a social configuration, it's an inheritance, and it's a way of relating, it's a form of sociality. All of these questions started to come to the foreground. I'm wondering if maybe we could also talk a little bit about how ochre and choreocratic ecologies is coming into this portion of our research process, and perhaps murmurations, the concept of murmurations, but where we're going with this work in the coming year.
What is okra? It's a vegetable, and it's a vegetable that has its origins comes from Africa, from ancient Egypt, and through the forced diaspora accompanied the slave ships, and since then were cultivated in different parts of the Americas. And so yeah, there is this relation with a diasporic process, and that wasn't the starting point. That's not how it emerged. It emerged in the sense that my own curiosities with how are the other ways we can find to talk about our researches, to talk about our creative processes, and how to talk about it, how to present it otherwise, that is not by the frames of representation.
So one day, over a year ago, we were in a meeting and we were stuck. We were trying to share our practices together as researchers in order to understand each other a little bit more, understand our relations between our own practice and the project of Dramaturgical Ecologies. And Cadu brought a proposition. He brought a lure for us in the form of okra. He said, maybe we're stuck. I'm paraphrasing, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting you. Maybe we're stuck, and maybe what we need to do is think about okra. And so, it was not, to repeat what you said, it was not initially it wasn't presented to us as a tool that was already formed, that could just sort of solve our problems and act as a metaphor for our diasporic relation to one another and our relation to diasporic Blackness, which is a key component of this project. it's definitely thinking Blackness and Black studies from the point of view of North America, but not only. We're thinking about Blackness. A number of us are studying with Bayo Okomolafe, who is a Nigerian scholar living in India. We find that Edouard Glissant really motivates our works and helps us think the poetics of relation. And he's from Martinique. And as I said earlier, Angélique also has an experience of non-North American Blackness, or she has an experience of Blackness which is not simply North American, although it clearly is part of it, in European concert dance, in her upbringing in Jamaica. And so we started to think with Okra in order to find ways of relating to one another otherwise. Find ways of relating to diasporic identity and practices otherwise. And our hope, I think through what we are calling choreocratic ecologies, is to find other ways to relate to the project of dramaturgical ecologies. And also, as we move dramaturgical ecologies in this sort of cellular expansion from Confession Publique, from this sort of absolute core of Angélique's research creation semi-autobiographical project with Melanie, we start to sort of expand outwards. And so once the ABCs of DE have been completed, we have a couple of partnerships and conversations that we're hoping to produce in the second half of this year in particular. And they're under the name murmurations. And murmurations, does one of you have a definition for murmuration?
Isn't it the movement of flocks of birds as they move, and the way that they, form, converge together and then disperse and then come back? And I've been looking at a lot of them by chance, but I was in Rome and it was just like these flocks of birds moving and creating shapes and then going in all directions, coming. It was so amazing. But I think it's the idea of like converging with each other, each own singularity, and retain that, but also create shapes together and then move about.
And it's that exactly. It's we've talked about Glissant's concept of difference without difference without separability is Denise
Ferreira da Silva.
Yeah, who's Afro-Brazilian, now living in Vancouver, I believe. But we came to the idea of murmuration, or the keyword of murmuration, through Fred Moten. He says that murmuration is a cool word because it bears the trace of the sound. So murmuration, it is beautiful when you watch those movements, but it's even more beautiful when you hear them. The internal difference of the swarm is absolute wealth. And so that key thing, that internal difference of the swarm is absolute wealth, to me really connects to the choreocratic and to okra, because as we've talked about the consistency of okra as a foodstuff, it's a cellular vegetable in the sense that there are different sort of seed cells, but also in different cooking techniques. Dana, you talked about the use of okra in making roux.
The roux specifically referring to food that comes from New Orleans or Louisiana, the state of Louisiana, and the way okra is used in so many dishes. And it is a lot of people are repulsed by this sliminess, but it is the sliminess that creates the foundation and the roux for the basis of the several dishes that they have, like gumbo and red beans and rice, even shrimp etouffee. But I think that that's part of the draw of what the okra does functionally as a way to enter into the project, is that part of the idea of exploring through okra is that we have such a diverse set of practices amongst us all. And we've been, over the course of this project, we've been questioning and exploring what it is that our collective methodology or practice is that we work with. And so it's a bit like we're, through the okra as an intercessor, a partial intercessor, that we're creating a roux for ourselves. And we still have yet to explore this like fully. So sometimes I feel like, how do we explain what we haven't really done yet? But this is the lure, like Matthew said. And we'll be working at this at the 3 Ecologies site as a research creation with our group specifically to explore more. So there'll be more on choreocratic after that.
We should, before we stop this, I think but all of you as well, it's important to acknowledge the work and in the thinking process of Ailey Bird, Melina Shalom, and Christian Scott, in all the thinking process that led to the ABCs of the year and to what we're presenting today from March 2020 onwards. It's been great allies and friends and colleagues.
Yeah, it's true. In order to not make too much of a murmuration in the podcast recording, we've had to reduce our numbers as research assistants so that we can theoretically speak clearly. But there is in the group a certain murmuration that comes from its diversity of voices. So Christian Scott, Melina Sialom, and Haley Baird have also been extremely instrumental in Dramaturgical Ecologies and its work so far. Thanks so much, Anna and Doug, for having us in Fourth Space. It was a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for this.
Thank you.
If you have an idea for a podcast, please let us know. You can contact us by email at info.4@concordia.ca or find us on social media at CU Fourth Space. We'd love to hear from you. The Fourth Space podcast is hosted by me, Douglas Moffat, and produced with Anna Voklebeck. Editing by Chanel Lees Marshall and Maximus Delmar. Social media and web support by Kari Valmstead. And our theme music, courtesy of Supercontinent. Thanks for listening.